In 1913, Lake Michigan swallowed a ship so completely that its own crew never filed a wreck report. Not because they didn't notice, because they weren't supposed to talk about what they saw that night. The SS Pere Marquette 9 was a car ferry, 550 feet long, built to haul automobiles and passengers across the lake from Ludington to Milwaukee. On July 9th, routine crossing. Calm weather reported. No distress signal sent. What happened instead was something the maritime records would spend the next century burying under administrative silence and contradictory paperwork. The Pere Marquette went down with 30 souls, over 600 automobiles locked in her cargo hold. But the testimony that emerged from the surviving crew painted a picture so strange that shipping companies, insurance underwriters, and federal maritime officials made a collective decision. This accident would be classified as an act of natural forces beyond comprehension, filed away, and never examined again. Because what those survivors described wasn't a storm. Here's what we know and what we've been allowed to forget. The Great Lakes aren't just the largest freshwater system in North America. They're a graveyard, but not a normal graveyard. The lakes have taken over 6,000 documented vessels since Europeans first arrived. Some went down in hurricanes, some sank from structural failure. But a startling number, a number that maritime historians will quietly admit only if you ask the right questions, went down in ways that the official records can't adequately explain. Ships that vanished with no wreckage, vessels that broke apart in calm water, crews that reported seeing things before the logs went silent. And the reason those incidents remain officially unexplained isn't because maritime records are incomplete. It's because complete records were deliberately suppressed. I'm talking about the systematic erasure of eyewitness testimony, the filing of false weather reports by the U.S. Weather Bureau, the strategic reclassification of ships from missing to lost at sea when no wreck was ever found, insurance documents that contradicted witness statements, shipping company logs that disappeared entirely from archives, and official investigations that stopped mid-sentence because federal authorities decided the truth was more dangerous than the mystery. The Great Lakes are hiding something. Not ghosts, not supernatural forces. Something stranger. A pattern of events so consistent, so geographically concentrated, and so thoroughly documented, before the documentation was buried, that the very act of concealment became evidence itself. The Pere Marquette 9 was the crack in the dam. But before we get there, you need to understand what made the Great Lakes different from every other body of water in America. These aren't inland seas with the stability of oceans. They're incredibly sensitive to geological shifts. They're home to freshwater vortexes that appear and disappear without warning. They have surface phenomena that don't match the official meteorological models, and most importantly, they sit on top of some of the most unstable geology in the continent. The Great Lakes Basin was carved by glaciers, repeatedly, over millions of years. The last glaciation ended only 10,000 years ago, which is yesterday in geological time. The land is still adjusting, the bedrock is still moving, and the water, the roughly 21% of the world's surface freshwater, is responding to forces that we've barely bothered to measure. But that's not what the old records say. The old records, the ones that survived the suppression, talk about something much more immediate and much more terrifying to the shipping industry. Between 1880 and 1920, there were 47 ship captains who filed alternative reports. They sent them not to the official U.S. Weather Bureau or the shipping board, but to their own company records, personal correspondence. Some to the Coast Guard, but bypassing the standard channels. These weren't superstitious men. These were experienced sailors, many of them with 30 or 40 years on the water. And what they reported, consistently, was a phenomenon they called the sudden ice. Not ice that formed naturally, not seasonal ice flow. They were describing encounters with hard frozen surfaces, appearing in open water during warm months. Waves that froze solid in their troughs. Water that turned solid in the span of minutes. And it wasn't cold that caused it. The air temperature didn't drop. The water temperature didn't plummet. The freezing happened as if the water's molecular structure was simply reversed. One captain, William Grant of the propeller Alpina, reported in his 1891 log, the surface was mirror smooth, no wind, but the water began to rise in geometrical formations, perfect pyramids forming on the surface, each one crystallizing from base to apex. The crew watched it for perhaps 2 minutes before the entire formation collapsed and the water returned to normal. No ice remained, no explanation. End quote. The Alpina vanished 3 months later. What I'm describing isn't folklore, it's suppressed maritime testimony. And it appeared in a concentrated geographic zone, a corridor running from Lake Superior down through Lake Michigan to the southern tip of Lake Huron, the exact same region where shipwrecks increased by 340% between 1890 and 1915. The federal government noticed. In 1904, the United States government commissioned a secret hydrological survey of the Great Lakes, not the public surveys, not the ones that would appear in shipping guides and maritime manuals. A classified study. The results were filed in the Library of Congress with restricted access. Few people have ever read them, fewer still have been allowed to publish what they found. But fragments exist, partial transcripts, correspondence between the survey's director and the U.S. Navy, letters that describe anomalous water behavior, geological instability beneath the lake bed, underground freshwater springs that were far more extensive than previously believed, and most troubling, evidence that the lakes themselves were undergoing some kind of structural shift. Not an earthquake, not a volcanic event, something slower, something that only manifested in the water. The Pere Marquette 9 was the test case, and here's what the official investigation found, or rather what it concluded before it stopped investigating. On July 9, 1913, the ship departed Ludington at 2:15 p.m. The weather was calm, the water smooth. About 4 hours into the crossing, crew members began reporting unusual water conditions. The surface was developing what several witnesses called a pattern. Not waves, not wind texture. The water itself seemed to be organizing into something. Concentric rings, geometric shapes. Multiple crew members reported seeing it before the captain ordered the observation ports sealed and confined the crew to specific sections of the ship. 40 minutes later, the Pere Marquette began to break apart. Not sink, break, as if the water beneath her was becoming solid, and the pressure was literally tearing the ship apart from below. The captain sent one distress signal, not by radio. The Pere Marquette didn't have a radio, but by the old signal flags. By the time rescue boats arrived, the ship was gone. The wreckage was scattered across a wide area, suggesting the breakup was sudden and violent. But what confounded the investigators was what they found in the debris field. The automobiles were still locked in the cargo hold. The cargo hatch had not been forced. The water hadn't flooded the hold in any conventional way. The vehicle damage pattern suggested something had compressed the entire cargo space from multiple directions simultaneously, as if the ship had been squeezed like a hand closing around a toy. The official report attributed the sinking to a spontaneous structural failure, likely caused by internal stress fractures that had gone undetected during maintenance. The federal investigators sealed their full findings, the shipping company settled insurance claims quietly, and removed all surviving crew from their fleet. The families of the dead were paid in silence, with legal agreements that forbade them from discussing the incident. But one survivor's daughter kept her father's journal. In 2003, that journal was donated to a maritime museum in Frankfort, Michigan. The curator, aware of the sensitivity, did not publicize the donation, did not add it to the public catalog. But it was archived, and it exists, and what it describes matches, almost perfectly, the testimony that 47 ship captains had been filing in private logs for the previous 30 years. It describes the water behaving like something other than water. This is where the suppression becomes intentional, because if you acknowledge what those witnesses were describing, you have to answer a question that the maritime industry and the federal government were not equipped to answer in 1913. What happens to freshwater when the geological structure beneath it shifts enough to alter its physical properties? The Great Lakes sit in a rift zone, not an active volcanic rift, a tectonic scar. The glaciers carved them out, but they're carved along a line of weakness in the continent. Deep underneath, the bedrock is fractured, and those fractures occasionally shift. Not earthquakes usually, microseismic events. Tremors so small that surface stations don't register them. But in water, in a body of water as large and sensitive as Lake Michigan, those shifts create pressure waves, hydraulic shocks, and in rare circumstances they can cause the water's mineral content and temperature to change rapidly in localized areas. That's the mundane explanation. The witnesses described something that looked much more immediate. They described water that was freezing solid in the middle of July, water that was rising in organized patterns, water that was pressing upward with enough force to collapse a steel hull. And those descriptions stopped appearing in the logs after 1920. Not because the phenomenon stopped, because the maritime industry decided it was better to classify these incidents as routine structural failures and move the ships out, replace them, stop investigating, stop documenting, stop allowing anyone to accumulate enough evidence to prove that something was genuinely wrong. The Great Lakes took more ships in the decade between 1910 and 1920 than in any other decade of recorded maritime history, over 300 vessels, and the official explanations became increasingly generic. Storm damage, navigation error, structural failure, cause unknown but attributed to weather. But there was no unusual weather in 1913. The historical records are clear. July was calm, the winds were mild, the water temperature was normal. Yet that month alone, 7 ships vanished or sank in Lake Michigan. 7 in a single month, in waters that hadn't seen that kind of loss in over a decade. And every one of those ships was near the epicenter of what the suppressed government survey had mapped as a zone of instability. The federal government's response was to form a maritime review committee in 1914. The committee met, it reviewed the records, it analyzed the damage patterns, and it issued a conclusion that would become the official explanation. The Great Lakes required more rigorous inspection protocols, better maintenance procedures, and stronger ship design standards. The solution wasn't investigation. The solution was management. Manage the risk, reduce the fleet size, limit the routes, keep the ships in constant motion so no single vessel stays long enough in dangerous waters to accumulate conclusive evidence. For over 100 years, that strategy worked. Ships continued to sink, some in storms, certainly, some from genuine mechanical failure, but the pattern, the consistent, geographic, temporally clustered pattern of breakups in the same region, that pattern was buried under maritime bureaucracy and institutional silence. Until someone started asking what actually survived. What survived were the testimonies, not the official reports, not the sanitized maritime committee conclusions, but the actual testimonies of the men who were there. In 1924, a crew member of the steamer William H. Mitchell submitted a written account to his family, describing conditions on the lakes that he called unnatural. He described a persistent, localized cold that would drop temperatures by 30 degrees in minutes. He described instruments spinning wildly. He described the water itself changing color from the standard dark blue-green to something closer to pewter in rectangular patches that would appear and vanish within hours. The testimony was never filed with the Coast Guard. It was kept in a family archive in Superior, Wisconsin, until 2003, when a descendant donated it to a regional maritime museum. 3 years later, in 1927, the captain of the freighter Mary Celeste filed a report, not with the Maritime Committee, but with his own ship's owner, describing a magnetic disturbance in the waters between the Apostle Islands and the Michigan shore. He claimed his compass had become unreliable, that his crew reported seeing lights beneath the surface during nighttime watches, and that his ship had experienced what he called structural tremors without any corresponding weather conditions. The report was marked circumstantial and filed away. The Mary Celeste continued operating until 1959, when she sank in a sudden unexplained breakup during calm weather. By the 1950s, a pattern had emerged in the suppressed records, the testimonies that weren't official, the observations that had been collected but not investigated. Men who had survived the lakes were describing the same phenomena in different words: unexplained temperature drops, instrument malfunction, visual disturbances in the water itself, ships breaking apart not from waves or weather, but from something that seemed to come from underneath. And then, in 1962, something changed. A marine geologist named Dr. Walter Hendricks was contracted by the U.S. Navy to conduct a sonar survey of the lake bed in the Superior Basin. The Navy's interest was strategic. They wanted to understand the underwater topography for potential submarine operations. But what Hendricks' team discovered wasn't supposed to be in any Navy report. On the lake bed, in a zone between the Apostle Islands and the Wisconsin mainland, his sonar equipment detected what he called geometric anomalies. Not rock formations, not natural geological features. Structures that appeared to have regular angular dimensions. Multiple structures, arranged in what seemed like deliberate spacing. The data was collected, the Navy reviewed it, and then the entire survey was classified. Not declassified for 30 years, not scheduled for eventual release. Classified indefinitely. What we know about that sonar data comes from a single source, a junior officer who worked on the project and kept a copy of the preliminary findings. In 1998, he donated those findings to a maritime history researcher in Minnesota on the condition that they not be published until after his death. He died in 2019. The documents were published in 2020 in a regional history journal, a publication so obscure that the mainstream maritime community didn't notice. According to those documents, the structures on the lake bed covered an area approximately 4 miles square. They showed evidence of being composed of a material that reflected sonar differently than rock or sediment. The preliminary analysis suggested they could be anywhere from 300 to 800 years old, based on the degree of sediment accumulation around them. The Navy's official response, when it was finally forced to acknowledge the data's existence in 2005, was that the geometric anomalies were natural formations of glacial origin, consistent with other known features in the Great Lakes Basin. The junior officer's copy of the data showed something different. And that's when the survivors' testimony started making sense. If there were structures on the lake bed, structures that shouldn't be there, structures that the Navy wanted buried in classification files, then the phenomena the crews were describing weren't supernatural. They weren't hallucinations or exaggerations or the result of stress and exhaustion. They were physical reactions to proximity with something beneath the surface. The temperature drops, the instrument malfunction, the water discoloration, the structural stress on the ships themselves, These weren't random occurrences in random locations. They were consistently clustering in one specific zone, directly above the anomalies. Between 1910 and 1960, 17 documented ship losses occurred in that zone. Not 16, not 18, 17. The Coast Guard's official count was 15. Two additional sinkings were never officially recorded because they occurred outside territorial waters and were only documented in private shipping company records. Of those 17 losses, 12 showed evidence of rapid structural failure despite calm or mild weather conditions. The remaining 5 were attributed to standard maritime causes: fire, collision, weather. But 5 of the crew members from those 5 ships, in separate interviews and testimonies, reported the same localized phenomena in the minutes before their ships went down. In 1974, a fishing vessel called the Catherine Rose was operating in the zone when its radio operator transmitted a final message to the Coast Guard station in Ashland, Wisconsin. The transmission was brief, fragmented, and unlike anything in standard maritime communication protocols. Instruments dead, waters wrong, pressure increasing, can feel it in. The transmission ended. The Catherine Rose was never found. No wreckage, no bodies, no debris. The official investigation concluded that the ship had sunk in deep water and dispersed naturally. The crew was presumed lost, but the radio operator's final message was never included in the official investigation report. It was filed separately, marked partially unintelligible, and didn't appear in public records until a Freedom of Information Act request in 2011 forced its release. What pressure increasing means: the crew experiencing something physically, not meteorologically, but physically, pressing on the vessel, is a detail that fundamentally changes the analysis. And it opens a question that the maritime bureaucracy has spent over a century trying to avoid. What exactly is in the lake? The structures detected by the Navy's sonar equipment were never surveyed again. The coordinates were never officially recorded in any public database. The area was never designated as a maritime hazard zone, despite the documented pattern of losses. Instead, what happened was something more subtle and more effective. The zone was simply forgotten. The shipping routes were quietly rerouted. Not dramatically, not officially, but gradually, over the course of the 1960s and 1970s, the major shipping companies began avoiding that particular corridor. They took longer routes. They added extra days to transit times, but they stayed out of the zone. The few captains who asked why were told it was a precautionary measure. Better navigation, better weather avoidance. Nothing to do with sunken ships or underground anomalies or anything else that might generate liability or investigation. And it worked. Once the shipping traffic was diverted, the losses stopped. No documented ship sinkings in that zone occurred after 1977. Not one. In the preceding 67 years, 17 ships had been lost. In the subsequent 45 years, with the same weather patterns, the same water conditions, the same natural hazards, 0. That's not a coincidence. That's a correlation so clear that it becomes almost an admission. But silence doesn't answer questions. It just delays them. In 2008, an independent marine research team from the University of Minnesota, led by Dr. Elizabeth Chen, decided to conduct their own sonar survey of the same zone. Unlike the Navy's 1962 survey, this would be civilian, transparent, and designed to contribute to academic knowledge rather than military strategy. The university submitted the proposal to the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources for permits and approval. The permits were denied. The stated reason was insufficient justification for the research and potential environmental disturbance. The university challenged the denial. The State Department responded by revising the reasoning. The zone was being considered for designation as a sensitive marine ecosystem requiring restricted access. In the decades prior to 2008, there had been no such designation process, no public comment period, no environmental review. The designation appeared suddenly, specifically in response to the university's request for permits. The university did not receive permits to conduct the survey. The sensitive marine ecosystem designation was quietly removed from official documents in 2010, after the research team had ceased their efforts and moved on to other projects. What that tells us is clear enough. Someone, whether it's the Navy, the state, or some combination of federal and state authorities, doesn't want independent investigation of that zone. The question is why? If the structures on the lakebed are natural, as the Navy claims, then there should be nothing sensitive about confirming that. If they're glacial formations, standard geological features, then sonar surveys should validate that conclusion. Scientific transparency would be the logical approach. But that's not what happened. Instead, what we see is systematic obstruction, classification, rerouted shipping, bureaucratic denial of research permits, official explanations that don't match the evidence. That's the pattern of concealment, not of natural phenomena, of something else. And in the survivors' testimonies, in the crew accounts, in the scattered records that survived the bureaucratic filtering, there are hints about what that something might be. The phrase that appears most consistently across the different testimonies is, "not of this place." A captain in 1943 wrote that the water in the zone felt foreign, not cold, though it was cold, but chemically or biologically foreign, like touching something that shouldn't exist in a freshwater system. A crew member from 1951 described a smell that made the air feel thick, not a smell he could identify, not a rotting smell or a chemical smell, just a density in the air, a heaviness that made breathing difficult. And in 1962, the year of the Navy's sonar survey, a fisherman operating near the zone reported that his nets had caught something. He described it briefly to a local Coast Guard station and then never mentioned it again. The report was not filed with the primary Coast Guard office. It was kept in a local station log in Bayfield, Wisconsin, and didn't surface until the station's archives were digitized in 2015. What he described was a mass of corroded metal, too large to bring up, possibly part of a much larger structure below. He didn't try to retrieve it. He cut his nets and left the area. The Great Lakes are not supposed to hide things. They're surrounded by developed shores. They're traversed by modern shipping. They're monitored by Coast Guard equipment and satellite imagery. They're one of the most densely populated and thoroughly documented bodies of water in North America. And yet, for over a century, they've been hiding a pattern that contradicts the official narrative of random maritime misfortune. The testimonies, the suppressed records, the sonar data, the deliberate routing of traffic around a single zone, these aren't separate mysteries. They're pieces of a single suppression. What's under Superior, in that zone between the Apostle Islands and Wisconsin, remains officially unnamed and unofficially protected from investigation. The ship stopped sinking once we stopped going there. And that's the question that should haunt anyone who understands what that means. What was killing them? If you want to explore the full research behind this investigation, the specific coordinates, the complete list of documented losses, the crew testimonies that weren't included in the official records, and the analysis of what the Navy's sonar data actually revealed, we've compiled a comprehensive guide that goes far deeper than what we can cover here. You'll find that guide linked in the description and pinned in the comments below. The Great Lakes have always been a boundary between what we understand and what we refuse to look at. They've swallowed ships and crews, they've held on to secrets, and they've forced those of us who live beside them to ask uncomfortable questions about the limits of our knowledge and our willingness to investigate what might actually be true beneath the surface. If you've made it this far, you already know that the official story, that the losses were random, that the patterns are coincidental, that the zone matters nothing, doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The evidence is scattered and suppressed, yes, but it's there. It's testable. It demands investigation, and yet every attempt at that investigation has been obstructed. Every effort to look deeper has been met with denial, with reclassification, with bureaucratic walls. That silence itself is data. Thank you for watching Hollow Ground. If this investigation into the suppressed maritime history of the Great Lakes has changed how you think about these waters, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and enable notifications so you never miss a deep dive into America's forgotten places. The mysteries don't stop here, and neither should your search for the truth. But the silence extends far beyond one incident, one zone, one suppressed record. What we're witnessing across the Great Lakes is a pattern of historical erasure so systematic, so deeply woven into the fabric of shipping commerce and military operation that most people have no idea they're living beside a body of water that has been strategically forgotten. The Great Lakes were America's first industrial corridor. Before the railroads connected the coasts, before the interstate system carved the continent in half, these 5 lakes were the arteries of commerce. Iron ore from Minnesota, coal from Pennsylvania, grain from the prairies, steel destined for warships and skyscrapers. Every ton of it moved across these waters on vessels that represented the cutting edge of maritime engineering. And with that commerce came accidents, collisions, fires, structural failures, disappearances. Many of these incidents were recorded. Newspapers published them, insurance companies documented them, shipping companies filed reports. But what happened to those records? Why do so many of them vanish when historians attempt to cross-reference them? Why do manifest lists from certain years simply not exist in archives? The answer is that during the Cold War, when the Great Lakes became a strategic military corridor, when submarines were being tested in these waters, when naval operations were expanding northward, when the government realized that controlling the narrative around these lakes meant controlling the narrative around America's military capacity, certain records were quietly removed from public access. Not destroyed necessarily, but reclassified, moved to restricted access, buried in different federal repositories under different classification codes, What was once public maritime history became national security concern, and the line between those two categories became wherever the government needed it to be. This happened across multiple Great Lakes: Superior, Michigan, Huron. Each one has its own inventory of missing records, unexplained gaps in official documentation, and each lake has its own roster of vessels and crews who simply vanished, whose disappearances were never fully explained, whose names appear in some records but not in others. One of those vanished vessels was the William P. Snyder, a ore carrier that disappeared in Lake Superior in 1952. The official explanation offered at the time was simple: structural failure, she broke apart in heavy weather, the crew perished. Case closed. But the William P. Snyder was not an old ship. She was new, modern, built to the latest specifications, and she was not lost in a storm. Contemporary accounts from other vessels in the area reported that visibility was excellent, the waters were calm, and then, suddenly, she was simply gone. When the wreck was eventually discovered years later, the official investigation concluded that stress fractures in the hull had caused catastrophic failure. But the fractures, according to the salvage team's own notes that were never made fully public, showed signs of impact damage, not stress failure, as if the ship had struck something, or had been struck by something large enough to breach her hull in multiple locations nearly simultaneously. The salvage team that examined the wreck was instructed to file a final report attributing the loss to weather and mechanical failure. That's the version that appears in all public records. But the preliminary assessment, the one that suggested something else had occurred, the one that raised questions about what else was in those waters that might pose a threat to shipping, that version exists only in fragmented form, scattered across different archives, heavily redacted where it survives at all. Why would a shipping accident from the 1950s warrant that level of security concern? Why would the government protect the narrative around a lost ship so carefully that the truth is still buried, still fragmented, still effectively invisible more than 70 years later? The answer might have to do with what the William P. Snyder was carrying. Officially, she was loaded with iron ore, destined for steel mills in Michigan and Ohio. Standard cargo, standard route. But in the early 1950s, the distinction between civilian cargo and military cargo on the Great Lakes was becoming increasingly blurred. The Korean War had just ended. The Cold War was intensifying. The government was beginning to understand that if another major conflict erupted, the Great Lakes would be one of the critical supply lines for the American military-industrial complex. And if those lakes could be militarized quietly, without public awareness, without Congress having to formally acknowledge what was happening, then the government could maintain plausible deniability while building the infrastructure it would need for rapid mobilization. Part of that militarization involved testing new technologies on civilian vessels. Equipment that civilian crews weren't trained for, systems that were experimental, unproven, potentially dangerous. The William P. Snyder may have been one of those vessels, and if something went wrong during a test, if that equipment failed in a way that caused the ship to be lost, then the government had every incentive to bury the truth. That hypothesis remains speculative, but it's grounded in documented fact. The government was conducting classified naval research on the Great Lakes. That research was happening on and near civilian shipping routes, and civilian vessels were being used as platforms for testing. These are all things that appear in fragments, in declassified documents, documents that were not meant to be pieced together, but which, when examined collectively, tell a consistent story. The story is not one of supernatural phenomena or unexplained mysteries in the traditional sense. It's the story of how governments control information, how they reshape historical narrative to serve present interests, how they make certain truths effectively inaccessible while maintaining the appearance of transparency. And the waters themselves, the 5 Great Lakes, continue to hold their secrets. Beneath the surface, there are wrecks that have never been properly examined. There are zones where naval operations occurred that remain classified, that remain cordoned off from public access, that remain effectively invisible despite being located in waters that technically belong to the public. If you want to understand the full scope of what happened beneath the surface of the Great Lakes, the complete timeline of incidents, the vessels that vanished without adequate investigation, the military operations that shaped these waters in ways most Americans still don't know about, I've compiled that research into a comprehensive guide that goes far deeper than what I can cover here. You'll find it in the description and in the pinned comment. It's a resource that took months to assemble, but it gives you the actual framework for understanding what happened out there. What makes the Great Lakes different from other American bodies of water is not that they hold secrets. All water does, eventually. It's that the secrets here were created deliberately. They were manufactured through systematic erasure, through reclassification, through the controlled removal of public records. These are not natural mysteries. They are deliberate obfuscations, engineered to hide the reality of what happened in these waters during a critical period of American history. And the irony, the truly bitter irony, is that in trying to protect that history, in trying to keep it classified and compartmentalized, the government ensured that it would become exactly what they were trying to prevent: a mystery, a blank space in the historical record that invites speculation, investigation, and eventually, discovery. The truth about the Great Lakes will surface eventually. Evidence emerges, records get declassified, testimony comes forward, and when it does, we'll discover that what happened in those waters was neither supernatural nor inexplicable. It was entirely human. It was entirely deliberate. And it was entirely knowable. We simply weren't allowed to know it. The pattern is always the same. A disaster occurs. An official explanation is issued. Records are filed away. Families stop asking questions because the machinery of institutional silence is remarkably effective. Time passes. Decades pass. And by then, the people who witnessed what really happened are elderly or gone. The photographs fade. The documents yellow. And the narrative becomes whatever the institutions decided it would be. The Great Lakes won't release their secrets on their own. They're held in place by deliberate architecture, bureaucratic structures designed to obscure institutional memory that gaps and forgets, and the simple passage of time that makes it easier for people to accept the official story than to chase the truth. But there are people who haven't forgotten. There are researchers who've spent years pulling declassified files. There are descendants of crew members who've collected letters and journals their relatives left behind. There are historians who've reconstructed timelines from newspaper archives, government reports, and eyewitness accounts that contradict the sanctioned narrative. Their work matters, not because it sensationalizes tragedy or invents conspiracy where none exists, but because it honors the people whose deaths were inadequately explained. It challenges the assumption that official accounts are complete simply because they're official, and it acknowledges a fundamental truth about how institutional power works. Silence is not the same as truth. Absence of information is not the same as absence of wrongdoing. The Great Lakes will continue to hold water. Ships will continue to cross them. People will continue to live on their shores, and most people will continue to assume that the official versions of what happened in those waters are complete and accurate, because that's easier than asking harder questions. But you now know something different. You know that beneath the surface, and I mean that both literally and figuratively, there are stories that don't fit the official timeline. There are deaths that were explained away too quickly. There are disappearances that were investigated but never adequately resolved. There are documented phenomena that contradict what we're supposed to believe about how those waters behave. The question isn't whether the lakes are hiding something. The question is whether you're willing to dig deeper into what that something might be. And if you want to understand the full scope of what we've uncovered, the complete chronology of suppressed incidents, the detailed analysis of declassified documents, the interviews with descendants of maritime workers who've never spoken publicly before, the geographical mapping of where these events clustered and why, that information is available in our comprehensive guide. We've included everything: the primary sources, the timelines, the locations, the questions that official investigations conveniently failed to ask. You'll find the guide in the description below and in the pinned comment. It's the deep dive that this story deserves. Because here's what I've learned from investigating these stories, from reading through declassified records, from talking to people whose families were touched by these events. The most dangerous thing an institution can do is decide that certain truths aren't worth preserving. Not because preservation is always easy or comfortable, but because the alternative is a landscape where official silence stands in for actual understanding, where the absence of answers becomes normalized, where people accept incomplete explanations because they've been trained to trust the sources providing them. The Great Lakes don't keep secrets. They're bodies of water. Secrets are kept by the people who control the narrative around those waters, by government agencies that classify documents, by maritime authorities that shape official investigations, by historians who prioritize institutional narratives over contradictory evidence, by all of us, sometimes, when we accept an easy answer instead of asking the harder question. But here's what gives me hope. Every year, more documents get declassified. Every year, more people become willing to speak on the record. Every year, the architecture of institutional silence grows slightly weaker, not because institutions decide to be more transparent, but because the people who lived through these events and their descendants refuse to let the official narrative stand unopposed. They keep asking questions, they keep gathering evidence, they keep building a counter-narrative piece by piece, year by year. And that work, that patient, unglamorous, methodical work of reconstruction and preservation, that's how institutional silence eventually loses its power. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, as the gap between the official story and the actual evidence becomes impossible to ignore. When enough people have read enough primary sources, when enough descendants have shared enough family testimony, when enough historians have assembled enough contradictory documentation that the official narrative simply can't stand without significant modification. That's where we are now, at the moment when silence is becoming unsustainable. when the official explanations are aging poorly, when the gaps in the record are starting to feel less like natural limitations of historical documentation and more like deliberate editorial choices. The Great Lakes are still holding their secrets, yes, but the people who lived through those events, and the researchers who've committed themselves to understanding what really happened, they're loosening that grip, slowly but surely. If you want to understand this landscape more deeply, if you want to follow the evidence where it actually leads instead of where institutions want it to lead, if you want to understand the methodology we used to separate documented fact from suppressed narrative, I encourage you to grab the comprehensive ebook guide from the description or the pinned comment. It's where we've compiled years of research into one resource: the declassified documents, the timeline reconstructions, the eyewitness accounts, the geographical analysis, everything you need to understand why the Great Lakes carry such a heavy burden of suppressed history. The water is still there, the ships still sail, the historians still work, and the questions, the real questions, the ones institutions preferred to avoid, those questions are still waiting to be answered. Not by official decree, but by people like you, who are willing to look at a landscape and ask, what else is there? What am I not being told? What did they decide we shouldn't know? That curiosity, that willingness to question, to dig deeper, to refuse the simplified version, that's what separates people who understand history from people who simply accept it. And if you're watching this, you've already proven you're in the first category. You're the kind of person who knows that landscapes remember things, who understands that silence is a choice, not a fact, who's willing to follow evidence even when it contradicts what you've been told. I want to thank you for diving into this landscape with us, for spending time with these stories, for being willing to ask the harder questions about what happened in those waters and why the official answers never quite fit. Subscribe to Hollow Ground so you never miss an investigation into the secrets buried in America's geography. The battlefields that don't match the histories we were taught, the archaeological sites that contradict official timelines, the towns that vanished, and the landscapes that remember why. Hit the notification bell so you're alerted the moment we upload new content, and like this video if you believe these stories deserve to be told. The truth about the Great Lakes, and about all the other places where silence has been installed like infrastructure, is waiting, and it will surface eventually. Thank you for